The United States of America and Israel have decided to launch military operations. These actions were conducted in clear violation of international law, something which we absolutely cannot approve or condone.
What if the most consequential statement of this entire war did not come from Washington, did not come from Tel Aviv, and did not come from Tehran, but from a podium in Beijing on a quiet Thursday morning? What if a single sentence, delivered in measured diplomatic language, just did more to paralyze the legal foundation of this war than any missile that has been fired in the last 6 weeks? Intelligence sources tracking the diplomatic cables, military analysts watching the Security Council floor, and geopolitical insiders monitoring the financial corridors are all converging on the same conclusion tonight, and that conclusion is not what mainstream media is telling you. This is not about Chinese oil contracts. This is not about a routine condemnation. And this is not about Beijing posturing for the global south. What China just did on May 7, 2026 is something far colder, far more calculated, and far more dangerous to the architecture of the American-led order than any of those surface readings suggest. Stay with us, because what we are about to reveal changes everything you thought you knew about where this war is actually heading. You are inside the briefing room. This channel does not chase headlines. We do not repackage wire copy, we do not parrot cable news talking points, and we do not flatter any single capital in this conflict. We treat every actor, Washington, Tel Aviv, Tehran, Beijing, Moscow, as rational players running cold strategic calculations, and we walk you through those calculations the way an intelligence officer would walk a senior policymaker through a morning brief. If you are new here, consider this your invitation to join the briefing. We cover what mainstream coverage refuses to go deep enough on, and we do it without picking a flag. If you have been with us through the earlier chapters of this war, you already know we do not do surface-level reporting here, and you already know why you came back. Tap subscribe, hit that like button, and let us get into it. To understand why China's declaration carries the weight that it does, you first need to understand the bigger picture, because this moment did not arrive in a vacuum. For the better part of 2 decades, the conflict between Iran on one side and the United States and Israel on the other has been fought in the shadows. It has been fought through proxy networks stretching from southern Lebanon through the Bekaa Valley, across the Syrian land bridge, into the militias of western Iraq, and down into the Houthi-controlled corridors of northern Yemen. It has been fought through cyber intrusions on centrifuge cascades at Natanz, through the targeted killings of nuclear scientists in the suburbs of Tehran, through tanker seizures in the Gulf of Oman, and through limited drone exchanges that both sides were careful never to call a war. That careful, deliberate ambiguity, that shared willingness on all sides to keep the conflict below the threshold of open warfare, was the load-bearing wall of regional stability for an entire generation. And in the last 6 weeks, that wall has come down. The joint American-Israeli strike package that hit Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, and the missile complexes around Kermanshah did not just damage Iranian infrastructure. It collapsed the entire architecture of strategic ambiguity that had governed this rivalry since the Bush administration. The G7 closed ranks behind Tel Aviv within 72 hours, framing the operation as anticipatory self-defense under a doctrine that, candidly, has no settled basis in the United Nations Charter. President Trump personally authorized the strikes from the Situation Room and framed the operation as the final closure of the Iranian nuclear file. And Iran, despite losing significant portions of its enrichment capacity and a meaningful slice of its senior IRGC command, did something the planners in Washington and Tel Aviv did not fully price in. Iran did not fold. The Foreign Ministry in Tehran issued a statement within hours declaring that America had crossed a red line, and the missile salvos that followed, directed at Al Udeid, at Al Dhafra, at Israeli air bases in the Negev, made clear that whatever this war was supposed to be, it was not going to be short, and it was not going to be clean. That is the board on which Beijing just made its move. And to understand the move, you have to understand that China rarely speaks in absolute legal language. Beijing prefers ambiguity. Beijing prefers the careful, deliberate fog of phrases like grave concern and all parties should exercise restraint. So when Foreign Minister Wang Yi stood at that podium on the 7th of May and used the specific words illegal and unjustified to describe the American-Israeli campaign, every China analyst worth their clearance immediately understood that something fundamental had shifted. Think about this carefully. Beijing did not say regrettable. Beijing did not say destabilizing. Beijing said illegal. That word choice is not accidental, and it is not rhetorical. It is the deliberate insertion of a legal claim into the diplomatic record, and once that claim is made by a permanent member of the Security Council, it becomes a reference point that every non-aligned state, every Global South capital, and every future tribunal can cite. China's permanent representative at the United Nations, Ambassador Fu Kong, reinforced the framing within hours, telling the Security Council floor that this war has dangerously destabilized the entire region and demanding an immediate ceasefire and a return to direct negotiations. Now here is where it gets critical. China is not just offering rhetoric. China is functioning, in real time, as Iran's diplomatic shield. Every draft resolution that has come before the Security Council attempting to retroactively bless the American-Israeli operation or to impose new sanctions architecture on Tehran for its retaliatory strikes has been quietly strangled in the consultation phase before it ever reached a vote. That is not accidental. That is a coordinated diplomatic operation, and it is being run out of Beijing. Now let us get into the strategic doctrine behind the move, because this is where the analysis separates from the headlines. China is not defending Iran out of affection. Beijing has no illusions about the Islamic Republic, and the relationship between the two states has always been transactional rather than ideological. What China is defending is something far more valuable to its own long-term position, and that is the principle that the United States cannot unilaterally redefine the international legal order through preemptive military force. Because if Washington can declare Iranian enrichment an existential threat and strike sovereign Iranian territory without a Security Council mandate, then Washington can apply that same doctrine, that same legal architecture, that same precedent to any program in any country that the United States designates as a threat. And every strategist in Zhongnanhai understands exactly which country sits next on that list of potential applications. The Chinese position, stripped of its diplomatic packaging, is a defense of sovereign immunity from preemptive strike. And Beijing is making that defense now, on Iranian ground, precisely so that it does not have to make it later, on its own. This is the same doctrinal logic that drove Soviet support for North Vietnam in the 1960s, the same logic that drove American support for the Mujahideen in the 1980s, and the same logic that drove Chinese intervention across the Yalu in 1950. The historical parallel that matters most here is Korea. In 1950, Beijing did not enter that war because it loved Pyongyang. Beijing entered because it could not tolerate an American military presence consolidating itself on the Yalu River. Today, Beijing cannot tolerate an American military doctrine consolidating itself as customary international law. The terrain is legal rather than physical, but the strategic calculus is identical. The international dimension of this is where the picture becomes genuinely complex, and where ordinary coverage falls short. Russia, predictably, has aligned its messaging with Beijing, with the Foreign Ministry in Moscow echoing the illegality framing within 24 hours. But Russia's position is constrained. Moscow is still absorbed by its own war in the Ukrainian theater. Its conventional munitions stockpiles are degraded, and its capacity to project diplomatic weight into the Gulf is a fraction of what it was a decade ago. The heavier lift is being carried by Beijing, and the diplomatic ambiguity of the rest of the world is itself a signal worth reading carefully. India has said almost nothing of substance, which tells you everything about New Delhi's discomfort at being forced to choose between its strategic partnership with Washington and its long-standing energy relationship with Tehran. The Gulf monarchies, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, have issued the most carefully worded statements of the entire conflict, calling for de-escalation without naming an aggressor, because they understand that they are physically sitting underneath the missile arcs, and that any wider war ends with their refineries and their desalination plants in the targeting cycle. Turkey has condemned the strikes in stronger language than Ankara has used in years against Israel, signaling that President Erdogan sees domestic and regional advantage in positioning himself as a defender of regional sovereignty. The European response has fractured beneath the surface of the unified G7 statement, with French and German officials privately briefing that the legal basis for the operation is, in their words, deeply uncomfortable. The question everyone in this briefing room is asking is whether that quiet European discomfort eventually surfaces into open daylight, and whether the transatlantic consensus that held for the first month of this war begins to erode as the casualties mount and the oil prices climb. This is exactly why the Strait of Hormuz now sits at the center of every threat assessment being written in every serious capital tonight. Roughly 20% of global crude oil and a comparable share of liquefied natural gas transits that 21-mile-wide choke point between the Iranian coast and the Musandam Peninsula. We are talking about something on the order of 17 to 20 million barrels per day, moving through a corridor that, at its narrowest point, has shipping lanes only 2 miles wide in each direction. Iran has not closed the strait, Let us be precise about this because the headlines have been sloppy. Iran has not closed the Strait of Hormuz. What Iran has done is something more sophisticated and, in some ways, more effective. Iran has introduced a sustained, deliberate ambiguity into the security environment of the strait. Through small boat swarming exercises, through anti-ship missile tests along the coastline, through GPS spoofing in the shipping lanes, through the boarding of one tanker and the harassment of several others. The closure does not need to happen. The threat of closure is itself functioning as the weapon, and that threat alone has driven Brent crude into territory not seen since the early days of the Ukraine war, with some assessments now placing it well above $120 per barrel and climbing. The International Monetary Fund has issued an extraordinarily blunt warning, by IMF standards, that if this war extends into 2027, the cumulative damage to the global economy will be catastrophic, with cascading effects on food prices, on fertilizer supply chains, on shipping insurance markets, and on the debt sustainability of dozens of import-dependent developing economies. This is the doctrine of supply chain degradation as a strategic weapon, and it is being executed almost textbook perfectly. The historical parallel here is the German U-boat campaigns of the Second World War, not in scale, but in logic. You do not need to sink every ship. You need to make every ship owner, every insurer, every refinery recalculate the risk. Once that recalculation begins, the economic damage compounds on itself faster than any military campaign can keep pace with. Now consider the psychological layer, because the human dimension of this war is what most analyses leave out, and it is what ultimately determines how long any of these governments can sustain their current postures. Inside Iran, the strikes on Natanz and Fordow were not received the way Washington's planners had hoped. There was no popular uprising against the regime. There was no fracturing of the security state. What there was, across multiple Iranian cities, was a hardening, a grim, generational hardening that drew on memories of the Iran-Iraq War, on the chemical weapons attacks at Halabja and Sardasht, on the 8 years of trench combat that shaped an entire Iranian political identity. National infrastructure in Iran is not understood the way it is understood in Western capitals. The nuclear program in particular is woven into Iranian national identity in a way that transcends the specific question of weaponization. It is understood as a symbol of scientific sovereignty, of the right of a non-Western power to pursue advanced technology without permission. When you strike that, you are not just degrading capability. You are striking at something the population experiences as a piece of itself. Inside Israel, the psychological terrain is different, but no less intense. The Iranian missile salvos that have penetrated the layered air defenses around Tel Aviv and Haifa, even in small numbers, have produced a national experience that Israeli society has not had to absorb at this scale before, and the political pressure on the Netanyahu coalition to deliver a definitive end state is now substantial. Inside the United States, the war is moving from the news cycle into the gas pump and the grocery aisle, and the political durability of the operation depends almost entirely on how quickly that translation happens, and how voters in swing states absorb the cost. Every one of these governments is now operating under a clock, and the clocks are not synchronized. Here is where it gets critical, and here is where deterrence theory becomes the only useful framework left. The most important fact about this entire conflict, 6 weeks in, is that none of the principal actors actually want the next escalation. Washington does not want Iran to close the strait. Tehran does not want a sustained American carrier-led campaign against its remaining infrastructure. Tel Aviv does not want a multi-front war that draws in Hezbollah's full missile inventory from southern Lebanon. Beijing does not want a regional war that disrupts 20% of its energy imports. Each of these actors is now relying on the credibility of their threats, rather than the execution of those threats, to manage the behavior of the others. That is the textbook definition of deterrence, and deterrence is fundamentally a psychological state. It holds until it does not. Intelligence assessments suggest that the probability of a deliberate, planned escalation by any single party is relatively low at this moment, but the probability of an inadvertent escalation, a misidentified radar contact, a miscommunicated order in a forward operating base, a tanker incident that spirals, is significantly higher than at any point since the early 1980s. We do not know, and analysts genuinely do not know, whether the Chinese declaration of illegality on May 7th is the first move in a longer Chinese diplomatic campaign to broker a ceasefire on terms favorable to Tehran, or whether it is a more limited signal designed to lock in a legal record without committing Beijing to active mediation. Sources indicate that back-channel communications between the Chinese Foreign Ministry in both Tehran and Washington have intensified in the last 72 hours, but the substance of those communications has not surfaced, and the absence of that substance is itself a piece of intelligence. When channels go quiet, it usually means the messages being passed are too sensitive to leak. What comes next is the question that every desk officer in every relevant capital is wrestling with tonight. There are three trajectories that the analytical community is currently weighing. The first is a Chinese brokered ceasefire framework, possibly stitched together with Omani and Qatari mediation, that freezes the conflict roughly along current lines and shifts the dispute back into a negotiated track on enrichment limits and inspection regimes. The second is a controlled escalation, in which Iran calibrates Strait disruption upward, Washington responds with expanded strikes on Iranian naval assets, and the conflict settles into a longer war of attrition that the global economy is forced to absorb. The third, and the one that keeps senior planners awake at night, is the inadvertent path. The unplanned incident, the misread signal, the rogue commander, that pulls the regional powers across a threshold none of them intended to cross. The Chinese declaration of illegality is, in our assessment, designed to make the first trajectory more attractive and the second and third more costly. Whether it succeeds will depend not on Beijing, but on whether Washington and Tel Aviv conclude that the political and economic price of continued operations has begun to exceed the strategic benefit. That calculation is being run in real time in rooms we are not in, and the answer is not yet settled. This is the moment in the briefing where we ask you to weigh in, because your perspective genuinely matters to this conversation. Do you think Beijing's declaration is the opening move of a serious Chinese mediation effort that ends this war before the end of the year? Or do you think it is purely a defensive legal posture designed to protect China's own future strategic options without committing real diplomatic capital? Drop your read in the comments below. We read them, we cite the strongest ones in future briefings, and the quality of the analysis in this community is genuinely one of the reasons this channel exists. If this breakdown gave you a layer of context you were not getting from the cable networks, sharing it takes 2 seconds, and it helps us keep bringing you this level of analysis. Hit that like button if you want more on the Hormuz scenario, on the Chinese mediation track, or on the Hezbollah Northern Front, and tell us in the comments which of those three you want first. We will be tracking the Security Council consultations, the back-channel signaling out of Muscat and Doha, and the order of battle reporting from the Gulf around the clock. When the next inflection point hits, and it will hit, you will hear it here, framed the way an intelligence briefing should be framed, without the noise, without the flag waving, and without insulting your intelligence. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and we will see you in the next briefing.